It's been 9 months since Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine, and whilst Ukraine has stood strong thus far, it's maybe a rough winter. The Ukrainians still have Western support, which was confirmed after 2 NATO meetings this week, with weaponry and monetary support pledged. But there are fears that the tide may be turning as Europe braces for a tough winter, with a cost of living crisis and recessions looming imminently. Will there be a point where public perception becomes more self-centred to the detriment of Ukraine? Will NATO follow through with its pledge? How long can Ukraine last with Russia's constant attacks on the power grid, especially with a cold winter on the horizon? What's next for Ukraine?
Okay, let's get to it, dear panelists. We've had you on the show several times in the past, and we keep on asking the same question, but obviously the reality on the ground brings up different answers. What is next for Ukraine? So let's start with this quick fire round of 30 seconds each, and we pick up the conversation from there. Maria Ionova, please take the lead.
Glad to hear and see you all. Ukraine is now facing a crucial winter of resilience and fighting. But the key is international support and solidarity. Military Ramstein, so-called, more weapons, more anti-air defense, fighter jets and tanks. And the more Ukrainians receive, the faster we will liberate our country. But do not forget that war is not this war is against the whole free world.
Yes, we're having slight technical difficulties with Maria. Hopefully we can fix that soon. Journalist Michael Tracy, your take, please.
Well, what's next appears to be more of the same, at least if you judge based on how the American government seems to be posturing itself toward this next phase of the war. There's been no real meaningful change in the rhetoric coming out of the U.S. administration or the massively high, supposedly existential stakes that are assigned to this conflict. So there's every reason to believe, fortunately or probably unfortunately, that we're just going to see a prolongation of the status quo.
Yes, last but not least, Dan Perry, maybe offering us a tiny bit of optimism.
I don't know about
Not today. Not today. Okay.
we're headed into winter, as we know, which suggests a time of perhaps regrouping and fighting, and maybe even recalculation and even negotiations. But if either side is inclined towards that, they're certainly hiding it very well. Meanwhile, Russia has half destroyed Ukraine's energy systems, which is going to lead quite possibly to a major humanitarian crisis and maybe cause Ukraine to attack Russia itself. The bigger picture is whether Putin, after making a big gamble and suffering maybe even bigger humiliation, is inclined to escalate or to cut his losses.
Well, let's feel free to interact from this point onwards, of course. Hopefully, again, Maria's connection will be solid enough for her to hear us and for us to hear her. And I must admit that it's a bit Shakespearean to have winter playing such a crucial role, right? If it was to be a play, probably get a human face again. But let's stop talking about Shakespeare. And now, is winter tilting the war in favor of Russia, or alternatively, can Europe survive a warring winter? Dan?
I think Europe appears to be prepared to weather the economic difficulty imposed upon it by its own unwise decision to become energy reliant on Russia. That appears to be more or less of a done deal. They're not going to buckle under because Putin has not only made his threats, but has essentially made good on those threats and caused them some pain on the energy side. So that's just very clear. I don't think that will change. What may change is if some horrible disaster happens in Ukraine. If the humanitarian crisis becomes so profound that there's enormous loss of life and it might even erode the Ukrainian willingness to continue to be as defiant as they have been. And we heard it from Maria. I mean, they want to liberate the entire country, and they want to go ahead and liberate Crimea, which was lost in 2014. And there's a lot of bravado there. And I mean, it's inspiring to an outsider to see the underdog behave in this fashion, but the reality is that the winter is going to be very brutal on the Ukrainians, and the Russians do have the wherewithal to make it even worse. I mean, they can destroy the energy system altogether and do much more. And they've shown a willingness to execute maneuvers that really harm the civilian population. Part of why they're so spectacularly unpopular right now in the West.
Maria, your thoughts? How is Ukraine bracing for winter? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you have heard my 30 seconds notes, but first of all, I'd like to say that a lot of countries were thinking that we will sail for 3 days, but almost 9 months in the full-fledged invasion. And do not forget that over 8 years of war in Ukraine, we know that when you are afraid of Putin, you're lost. And that is why I think that such great support of our international partners shows that Ukraine is successful, and also standing tall to Russia blackmails in different spheres. The war has been proven that they have not much in their arsenal to blackmail not only us but the whole world, because we remember the nuclear threat, and we also remember the strong reaction during the meeting of G19, because I can say G20. So when we are talking about they have tried blackmailing with the starvation, and also that the grain deal
maneuvers there,
is fine, and we have absolutely. So that is why now, yes, Russia tries to to weaponize winter against us. But this is the reason why they bomb our critical infrastructure. And by the way, now we are sitting with you, and all over the country we have air alarm. And but it's also also this is the reason why they bomb our critical infrastructure. But it's not only; it's also the reason why they would like to try freezing the entire Europe. And this coming winter, I can say that it's just about another blackmailing. That is why we have to be strong and stay strong.
But in this respect, Michael, Tracy, can anyone other than Putin really bring an end to the war? Should the West perhaps change its working assumption that Putin's power is at stake?
Well, the war seemingly hinges on the continued support and quote-unquote aid that's being provisioned at enormous rates by primarily the United States. And the United States doesn't seem to have changed its posture toward this issue really at all, even despite a couple key developments of late that you would have, if anything, occasioned such a change in those policy postures. So, for example, a couple weeks ago, as everyone probably recalls, there was the incident where President Zelensky and top Ukraine government officials immediately accused Russia of deliberately firing missiles
to Poland,
at Poland, which could have precipitated a major escalation if what those Ukraine government officials said had been accurate. But apparently it was not accurate, or at least it was contradicted by the U.S.
Well, no, that was a journalistic error.
Countries. Well,
I mean,
no, it wasn't a journal. It was Ukraine government officials themselves made the factual assertion that this had happened according to their supposed perception. So it wasn't.
And more than that, Ukraine denied from the get-go any involvement, and later on, when the details were revealed, it didn't really took any responsibility for that. Not that anyone asked for it, but yeah.
And Ukraine government officials have, since the beginning of the war, been lobbying for ever more U.S. intervention, and so they use that as yet another opportunity to conduct that lobbying initiative. And, there was a slight backlash to what seemed like reckless behavior on the part of Ukraine, which is essentially a U.S. client state, but that was coincided with no real fundamental reevaluation of the wisdom of the policy, right? So even after that incident, which potentially brought the U.S. and the world on the precipice of some major escalatory incident, Congress in the U.S. still seems poised to pass what would be the largest tranche of so-called aid since February.
Yeah.
The Biden administration submitted a proposal that dwarfs in its size any proposal that has been yet submitted to Congress in terms of supplies and armaments and so forth. So if that does get passed, as it seems likely to do this month, then it just shows that there's very little reason to believe that there's going to be any major alteration at all in the fundamental trajectory of this conflict, at least from the standpoint of the U.S., which is the decisive factor, backstopping Ukraine.
Yes, Maria,
If I may, yes, thank you. If I can mention that we shouldn't forget that Russia, it is very hard for Russia to understand that free nations do not trade, electricity and heat for their territorial integrity and independence. And that is why there is no blackmailing or threat that is able to bring us down. And I think that the same for our Western partners. Still we have assistance. Still we have this unity and solidarity of Ukraine. That is why I strongly believe that the West will keep supporting Ukraine in winter. And we know a lot of initiatives. And we also mentioned that we need a so-called two Ramstein frameworks in winter. It's military Ramstein and energy Ramstein. If Putin keeps following his such terrorist agenda and aims at total destruction of Ukrainians' power system, he just wants to deprive, Ukrainians from every commodity like heating, water, electricity. But believe us, we have so many friends. We can deal with this, and I think that Ukrainian nation has already proved it.
Look, I have to say,
especially after last attack.
Yeah, Dan Perry, please. Yeah.
I think Michael's right. As was the case from the beginning, we have basically three players here: the West, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. The West is at a run rate right now. They're going to do what they're doing, which is defending Ukraine at a certain cost structure. Rather, provisioning Ukraine at a certain cost structure that is acceptable to the West, even though it's painful. The Ukrainians, as I say, are manifesting great bravado when they're going to fight to the hilt, no matter what, even if no one has electricity. I'm not so sure about that, but that's their position, and it's courageous and admirable. The pivot factor is Putin. Putin will decide which way this goes, and it's incredibly annoying, and it's undignified for the West, frankly. And we don't really know which way it's going to go. And I think much of the West is assuming that Putin will keep the war going, at least as a war of attrition, unless he's brought down. Now, how do dictatorships come down? Russia is not in a position where it's likely the people are going to bring down Putin. It has to come from an insider rebellion, as has happened in some dictatorships, or a military action.
Or again, changing the working assumption that peace could only be made, or truce without Putin. We're taking a short break now, but we continue our discussion right after it. Do not go anywhere. We're back in a bit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, journalist Michael Tracy, Ukrainian parliament member Maria Ionova, and of course Dan Perry, international affairs analyst. Thank you all so very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, obviously, but first let's take a listen to NATO chief, as NATO ministers are convening in Bucharest to decide or discuss future assistance to Ukraine, and perhaps suggesting that NATO is having second thoughts on its expansionist policy and the price that comes with it. More than all else, let's take a quick listen.
I think if there's one lesson learned from Ukraine, is that we need to support them now. The more support we are able to provide to these countries, being different, but under Russian pressure, influence in different ways, it is much better to support them now than when we have seen developments going in the absolutely wrong direction, as we saw with the invasion of Ukraine earlier this year.
So let's get to it. Another quick fire round of 30 seconds each with a simple question. Should NATO expand at all? Michael Tracy, please take the lead.
Well, it doesn't appear that NATO is having second thoughts at all about its expansionist designs. And you're correct to use the term expansionist, because for one thing, there's zero doubt that they're expanding far beyond anything close to their original geographic remit. Even just yesterday, it was reported by the Financial Times that NATO has officially conducted a meeting around its reaction to a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Is that anywhere close to the North Atlantic, which is part of the name of the alliance? Not last I checked.
Yeah, and putting China on its list of updated lists of strategic threats, so to speak. So we're definitely seeing a different raison d'etat here, as you're alluding to, perhaps. Michael Tracy, Dan Perry, your thoughts?
Well, NATO is a bit of an alliance in search of a mission, and I guess they feel they found one now, not just in China, but also in the case of Russia. Now, look, the heart says yes, they should expand because Russia has proven such a menace to its neighbors, and a line should be drawn in the sand and a point should be made. But the head says, I think, no, because it may give a plausible grievance to a bad faith player, which is never a good idea. And also, NATO is perfectly capable of defending whoever it wants, even without formal membership, as Ukraine has shown.
Right. Maria Yanova, your take? Obviously, the Ukrainian bid is still up in the air.
I think that NATO must expand to guarantee security and resilience of the West and the free world. Because Ukraine, it's not a burden, but it's a great asset for NATO. And today, NATO is not only about security, but it's also a beacon of democracy for the whole world. And that is why a strong and solid democracy able to defend members and to protect values. And for Ukraine, as we have talked before, no better security guarantee, only membership in NATO.
Well, let's just remind ourselves that whether we agree with that or not, the casus belli of Putin launching this war was NATO's potential expansion eastwards. But I do want us to circle back to what's happening inside Russia and expand our conversation a bit. You know, we're seeing protests in China. We're seeing protests in Iran. We're not seeing any protests in Russia. How come, Maria?
Unfortunately, this society was poisoned by the whole more than 20 years by Putin's regime, and that is why we didn't expect such brutality of war crimes with our people. But I can tell you that there were also their fails on the battlefield, and believe us, when we are in contact with our military guys, Russian soldiers are very low morality. The problem is that, as during the Second World War, they could be shooted from their back. But as you know, now the successful stories in Kherson and Kharkov by our armed forces are really making the morality of Russian soldiers not very good. But Bakhmut, where are now the really very hard fights, it's now like a battlefield because they're Wagner groups. I mean, it's another story. And I can tell you that, for example, my nephew was wounded 2 weeks ago near Bakhmut, and one of my close friend is now a missing person, and I'm really afraid that we will not find him. Yeah. But again, Russian soldiers and Russian people, you know, they're sick, because when you can hear the moms and, wives such messages when they're saying that, oh, you know, what did you stole, or how, or have you raped any Ukrainian Bandera women? So what we can expect from them? Do they value humanity? Do they value dignity? And, you know, after last missile attack, when the maternity house was damaged, and just 2 days boy was killed by this missile. I mean, can we, and especially, you know, I will tell you that we now hear a lot of issues about dialogue. Can again? I mean, what dialogue? What negotiations? I mean, when they are
the negotiations will arrive at one point or another. But Michael Tracy, is it really just fear that is keeping the streets of Russia empty from protesters, or are Russians simply still very much on board?
Well, it's difficult to say. It's difficult to really obtain reliable public opinion data out of Russia. I would try to connect this to something that your guest said in the prior segment, which I found extraordinary. He suggested that only Putin is the decisive player here. Only he is the key decision maker in terms of the outcome of the war. And of course, no one would deny, or at least no one rational would deny, that Putin is a major player in how this war ends up resolving itself or not. But that kind of takes the mark off the United States and its singularity as a player here as well. Because if you pretend that only Putin can make a decision that could fundamentally alter the course of the war, it denies that the United States is almost single-handedly enabling Ukraine's entire war effort, not just through provision of so-called aid and not just through disbursements of giant amounts of money, but through active operational coordination of the war. So this idea that the war could only come to a conclusion if there's some sort of uprising in Russia, or even your guest suggested that there could be some kind of military action to impose regime change on Russia. That's an incredibly extreme
Michael, I mean, I have to say,
Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and to just casually propose that there could be some kind of military incursion to topple the Kremlin.
No.
I mean,
You misunderstood.
We've really gotten ahead of our skis here.
Michael, I meant an action by the Russian military. How do dictatorships end? They generally end when insiders or the military put an end to them. And that may be a scenario that's coming in Russia. The other alternative for dictatorships to end, or for dictatorial regimes to fall apart, is when they lose energy and they lose hearts and they just give up, the way, interestingly, the Soviet Union did, or the way apartheid South Africa did. I did not mean an incursion into Russia by the West. That would be insane, and you're right to call that out if that would have been what I meant.
Politicians who have actually called for that. I mean, the senator from South Carolina,
that would be
at the beginning of the war actually called for the assassination of Putin. So
even President Biden at some point
I don't think I want to be in that particular company, Michael.
Even President Biden himself had a remark. I wouldn't dare to try and rephrase it, but suggesting that only a regime change is sought after.
He said this man.
Look, the trouble is that this version.
Thank you, Michael.
This version of the Kremlin does not appear to be willing to admit defeat. It isn't in their DNA to admit defeat, and that is a very big problem. When you have a player who acts that way and probably isn't bluffing, then they need to be defeated. Maria's right; they need to be defeated. The question is, what does defeat look like? What does defeat look like that doesn't push them so much into a corner that it brings about a worse result than a continuation of the war?
Well,
by which I mean,
redefining terminology. Let it be what.
Only total defeat of Russia, or only the infliction of regime change on Russia, could bring about a conclusion.
Michael, Tracy, unfortunately, we ran out of time. Michael, Dan Perry, Maria Yonova, thank you so very much for this. See you again soon.